The glass went first. Not the whole window, just enough of it. A boot through the lower pane of Seal's Café's front door, and the sound cracked across the dining room like something breaking loose in the world. Jack Reyes didn't turn around right away. He finished pouring the coffee he was pouring, watched the last inch of it settle, steaming into the mug, and only then looked up. 3 men. Leather vests. Patches on the back nobody in Millfield had ever wanted to read too closely. The one in front kicked a chair on his way past, just to hear it go over. "Morning," Jack said. Flat. Unbothered. The way a man says it when he already knows exactly how the next 60 seconds are going to go, and has decided, for now, to let it happen anyway. The biggest one, shaved head, a wingspan built for exactly this kind of entrance, didn't answer him. He swept his forearm down the pastry case and sent it crashing to the tile. Behind the counter, a framed photo shifted on the wall. A man in fatigues, younger, harder-eyed, half smiling at a camera somewhere that wasn't Millfield. Then the second one grabbed Maddie. She'd been carrying a tray toward table 6, and he caught her by the wrist hard enough that the tray went sideways and the plates went with it. And for 1/2 second, the whole cafe, 6 customers, an old man reading a paper by the window, a mother with a stroller near the door, went completely, perfectly silent. "Let go of her," Jack said. Not loud. That was the thing everyone in that room would talk about later, how a man watching someone grab his daughter didn't raise his voice at all. He set the coffee pot down on the counter, slow, deliberate, the way you set something down when your hands need to be free for something else. The man holding Maddie laughed. "Well, what, old man?" Jack looked at him the way you'd look at someone who just said something a little sad. Not angry, not afraid. Almost, and this was the part that would bother the man for a long time afterward, though he wouldn't understand why until much later, disappointed. "You really don't want to find out," Jack said. The shaved head one, the one who seemed to be running this, grinned and stepped up onto the register counter like he owned it. Boots on the wood, Jack had refinished himself 2 summers ago. He looked around at the flag on the wall, the framed unit photo, the little brass plaque by the register that read, "The only easy day was yesterday." And something about the arrangement of it, the flag, the plaque, the quiet old man in an apron, struck him as funny. "Navy SEAL Café," he read off the window lettering, mocking it. "This your whole life? Coffee and flags?" He looked past Jack toward the kitchen, toward the framed photos that lined the back wall. A dozen young faces in uniform, some of them, Jack's regulars all knew, never made it home. Guess even heroes gotta retire sometime. Guess even heroes end up nobody. Maddie tried to pull free. The man holding her yanked her back, harder this time, and her shoulder caught the corner of the counter. That was the moment the old man behind the counter and Jack Reyes stopped being the same person. He came around the counter without seeming to hurry, which was somehow worse than if he had. 3 customers would later swear he crossed 15 feet in under 2 seconds. None of them could explain how that math worked. He didn't say anything else. He'd already offered the only warning he intended to offer, and the man who'd laughed at it was about to learn the specific cost of that mistake. But that isn't where this story ends. It's barely where it starts. Because 40 minutes earlier, in a garage 2 miles off Route 9, the man giving these 3 their instructions had said one thing before they left that none of them had thought twice about. Don't hurt anybody bad. Just make sure the old man understands who runs this street now. He hadn't asked who the old man used to be. Nobody had thought to ask. There was a plaque behind that register, a wall of photographs nobody in the club had looked at closely enough, and a folded flag in a glass case in the back office that had been there so long the regulars had stopped seeing it at all, the way you stopped seeing anything you walk past every single day. None of that would have meant anything to 3 men who'd never served a day in their lives. It was about to mean everything. 3 days before that morning, the same cafe had been quiet. The ordinary kind of quiet Jack had built on purpose. The kind you get from opening at 5 a.m. every day for 6 years, and never once raising your voice at anybody who worked for you. Maddie had been behind the register then too, same as most mornings since she'd moved back to Millfield the year before. Back when she needed a place to be, they didn't ask her too many questions, and got one anyway. Along with a job and a key to the back door, and a father who'd waited a long time to have her home. That was the morning Des Cole walked in for the first time. He'd come in smiling, 3 men trailing him the way men trail someone they're afraid of. and he'd sat at the counter and told Jack, pleasant as you like, that a neighborhood like this had gotten dangerous lately. Said, for a modest weekly consideration, he'd make sure nothing happened to a nice little place like this. Jack had bought him a coffee, free of charge. Then he'd said one word, quiet enough that Des had to lean in to be sure he'd heard it right. No. Des had laughed it off. Said he'd swing back around when Jack had thought it over properly. Maddie had asked him afterward, worried, if maybe it was easier just to pay it. Jack had wiped down the counter and told her men like that talked bigger than they hit. He'd believed that. Mostly. What he hadn't told her, what he'd decided, standing right there at that counter, the moment Des Cole walked back out his front door, was that he already knew exactly how this was going to end if Des came back. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to that. It had come to that. And now, 3 days later, with glass on his floor and his daughter's wrist bruising purple under a stranger's grip, Jack Reyes was about to show 3 men who'd never once wondered what kind of man built a cafe out of an old diner and called it Seals exactly how badly they'd misread the room and exactly how much bigger this was about to get for all of them before the sun went down. If you're rooting for Jack, hit subscribe, like this video, and share it because the real fight is only beginning. Maddie hit the counter and the man who'd grabbed her let go a half second too late, the way people do right before they understand they've made a mistake they can't take back. Jack didn't run at him. He walked the same unhurried walk he used behind that counter every single morning, and something about the calm of it made the shaved head one on the register laugh again, thinner this time, less sure of itself. You gonna hit me, old man? I already told you not to make me, Jack said. He wasn't looking at the man on the register. He was looking at the one who'd grabbed Maddie, and everything about the way he crossed that floor said the register would keep. None of them knew yet what kind of mistake they were standing inside of. They wouldn't know for another few minutes, not until the first one hit the floor and stayed there, not until the second one understood, mid-swing, that his fist was never going to land where he'd aimed it. For now, they only knew what any of the Iron Reaper's targets ever knew going in: an old man behind a counter, a business on a strip that had learned to pay quietly, 3 days of warning already given and ignored. What none of them had bothered to ask, what Des Cole hadn't bothered to ask either, 3 days earlier, when he'd sat at this same counter and smiled at a man twice his age like the outcome was already decided, was who exactly had built this place. And why, and what he'd carried here from somewhere else entirely. 6 years earlier, Jack Reyes had been sitting in a rental car outside a Veterans Affairs office, in a different state, staring at a folder he hadn't opened yet. He'd spent 22 years doing work he still couldn't fully talk about, most of it overseas, most of it the kind of work that trains a person to read a room in half a second and never once show what they're thinking while they do it. He'd come home the way a lot of men like him come home, intact on paper, quieter than he used to be, uncertain what a Tuesday was supposed to feel like when nobody needed him to move before sunrise. The folder in his lap that day held a business plan for a diner, his own handwriting, cramped in the margins. Coffee, honor, country. He'd written that line at 2 a.m. without knowing exactly why it mattered to him, only that it did. He didn't open the VA folder that day. He drove 3 hours north instead, to a rundown building with a for lease sign in the window, in a town called Millfield that he'd only ever passed through once, and by the end of that week, he owned it. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done for 22 years. He told the town he was retired military, which was true, and let them fill in the rest with whatever felt comfortable. Most people pictured a supply clerk. A few pictured something closer to the truth, and never said so out loud because, in a town like Millfield, some things you let a man keep to himself. What Jack built instead was a place. Photographs of the men he'd lost lined the back wall, not explained, just present. A flag folded into a glass case that had been given to him by people who understood exactly what it meant and never once needed to say it. Veterans found their way in without anyone advertising for them, the kind of thing that happens naturally when a place feels safe in a way people can sense before they can explain. Maddie had come a year ago, from a life Jack didn't push her to talk about, and never would, and he'd handed her an apron and a key, and, in 6 years of running that cafe, had never once raised his voice at anyone who worked for him. Not once. She hadn't asked why the wall of photographs existed. She'd understood the way people understand grief without needing a lecture on it, that some rooms hold what they hold, and you don't go digging. That was the man behind the counter 3 days before the glass came in. That was the man Des Cole sat across from and misjudged completely. Des had come in with two of his crew trailing behind, boots up on stools where the coffee cups belonged, looking around at the flag and the photographs, like a man appraising something he intended to take. He'd smiled the whole time. That smile never once made it to his eyes. He told Jack the neighborhood had gotten dangerous lately, said for a modest weekly consideration, he'd personally make sure a nice little place like this never had any trouble. Jack had poured him a coffee, free, then set it down in front of him without a word. $200 a week, Des said. That's fair, right? Fair for peace of mind. No, Jack said. One word. Quiet enough that Des leaned in, sure he'd misheard. He hadn't misheard. The whole cafe had gone still around them, the way a room does when it senses something has shifted, even if nobody in it could say exactly what. Des's smile flickered, just once, like a candle catching a draft it hadn't expected. He wasn't used to that word. Every business on that strip had learned to say yes fast, before things got expensive. The hardware store 2 doors down had learned it the hard way, after a brick came through their window. The laundromat had learned it after a fire that everyone quietly agreed not to call arson. Des laughed it off, the way men do when they need the room to believe they're still in control of it. Said he'd swing back around once Jack had thought it over properly. Then he and his men walked out, and the whole cafe let out a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Maddie came over once they were gone, scared, and not bothering to hide it. Maybe we should just pay it, she said. It's not worth somebody getting hurt over. Jack wiped down the counter, unhurried, the same motion he'd use 100 more times that week. Men like that talk a lot bigger than they hit. He believed that. Mostly. What he didn't tell her, what he'd already decided, standing at that register the moment Des Cole walked back out his front door, was that he knew exactly what kind of man he'd just told no. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to anything more than words. He let Maddie keep believing it might blow over, because that was the only mercy he had to offer someone who'd already carried enough fear before she ever walked into his cafe. 3 days passed, quiet ones. Jack almost let himself believe Des had moved on to easier targets. Then that morning arrived, the boot through the glass, the pastry case crashing to the tile, Maddie's wrist caught in a stranger's grip hard enough to bruise, and every quiet thing Jack had built over 6 years came apart in under a minute. The way things do when a man who talks bigger than he hits finally decides to test that theory on the wrong person. Des hadn't come himself. Too smart for that. Or maybe just smart enough to send men he could afford to lose if things went wrong. He had no idea yet exactly how wrong they were about to go. Not the shakedown, not the diner, not the quiet man who'd told him no, with a coffee pot still warm in his hand. By the time his phone rang later that afternoon, Des Cole would understand precisely how badly he'd misjudged the situation. He just didn't know it yet. The one who'd grabbed Maddie swung first. He put his whole shoulder into it. A wide, looping punch meant to end things before they started, and Jack let it come to him, watched it travel. At the last possible half second, he tilted his head 3 inches to the left, and the fist went past his ear into nothing. Before the man even understood he'd missed, Jack's hand was already closing around the back of his neck. One motion. The man's face met the edge of table 6 hard enough that the coffee cups jumped, and he didn't get back up. The cafe held its breath. Somewhere behind the counter, a pot of coffee kept hissing on the burner, the only sound left in the whole room. The second one, shaved head, still standing on the register counter like he owned it, stopped laughing. He looked down at his friend on the floor, then at Jack, and something in his face shifted from entertained to uncertain. The particular kind of uncertain that comes right before a man decides he has to prove something, to save face in front of a room full of strangers. He grabbed the coffee pot off the counter, the one Jack had set down not 2 minutes earlier, and swung it at Jack's head. Jack stepped inside the swing instead of away from it. The pot caught him across the shoulder instead of the skull, and hot coffee sprayed across both of them, across the counter, across the framed photo of the flag that hung crooked now on the wall behind the register. Jack drove a fist up under the man's ribs while he was still finishing a swing that had already failed, and the pot clattered out of fingers that had forgotten how to hold anything. The third one came through what was left of the front door at a dead run, boots crunching over glass, and threw a punch built entirely out of panic. Jack leaned away from it, caught him by the collar, and walked him straight back through the doorway he'd just come through. What glass hadn't already come down, came down then, in one long collapsing sheet, and the man landed on the sidewalk in the middle of it. 9 seconds, maybe 10. 3 grown men on the floor or the pavement, and one 61-year-old man standing behind his own counter in a coffee-stained apron, breathing normally, looking at his daughter to make sure she was still upright. Someone in the cafe laughed, the nervous kind, the kind that only escapes a body once it believes it's safe again. The mother by the door pulled her stroller a little closer. The old man with the newspaper hadn't moved the entire time, hadn't so much as lowered the page, and would later tell 3 separate people at the hardware store that he'd never in his life seen anything like it, and wasn't sure he believed it himself, even having watched it happen. Jack checked Maddie's wrist first. Already swelling, already going the deep purple red of something that was going to need ice, and probably an X-ray. She didn't cry. She stood very still and let him look at it, and something passed between them that neither one said out loud, the particular silence of a daughter understanding, for the first time in her adult life, that her father was capable of something she'd never once seen and had never once been told about. "Go sit down," Jack said, gentle now, nothing left of the voice he'd used 30 seconds earlier. "I've got this." He told the 3 men on his floor, quiet, to get up and crawl back to whoever sent them. Told them the cafe wasn't paying. Not that week, not ever. They went. Limping, none of them looking back, the one from the sidewalk leaving a smear of blood across broken glass on his way out. Jack swept up what he could with one hand, the other arm already starting to stiffen where the pot had caught his shoulder, and told the regulars breakfast was on the house. The room filled slowly back up with low talk, people already starting to turn 9 seconds of violence into a story they'd tell for the rest of the year. Jack poured himself a coffee he didn't drink and sat for a moment on the stool behind the register, rolling a shoulder that ached in a way it hadn't in a long time. He looked, for a minute, exactly like what the town believed him to be. A tired man who'd handled some trouble and wanted to put it behind him. He was wrong about that, though he didn't know it yet. 2 miles off Route 9, in a garage that smelled like motor oil and old carpet, the 3 men limped in through a side door, and Des Cole's face went from irritated to furious in about 4 seconds. "One old man," Des said. "And the 3 of you look like you went through a wood chipper." Nobody answered him right away. The one with the busted lip was still holding his ribs. The one who'd taken the table edge to the face wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. It was Ray Doss who finally spoke, the oldest man in the room by a decade, a patch holder who'd ridden with rougher outfits than the Iron Reapers long before Des was old enough to shave, and who'd been quiet through most of the shouting, watching the other 2 describe what had happened with a look on his face that had nothing to do with anger. "Say that again," Ray said. "The part about the coffee pot. And the door." The busted lip one repeated it. The countervolt, the way the old man moved, the collar throw through the front glass like it weighed nothing. Ray sat down slowly on an overturned crate, and something in the way he did it made the whole garage go quiet. "What's this guy's name?" Ray said. "Full name. On the sign, on the paperwork, whatever you got." "Reyes," Des said, annoyed at the detour. "Jack Reyes. Some old vet who thinks a flag on the wall means something." Ray didn't say anything for a long moment. He was looking at nothing in particular, the middle distance, the way a man looks when he's checking a name against something buried a long way back. A name people used to say quiet, the kind of quiet that meant you didn't want it to carry. "You said Reyes," Ray said again, like he needed to hear it a second time to believe it. "Millfield. The cafe with the flags. Yeah. So?" Ray looked up at Des, and for the first time since anyone in that garage had known him, something that looked almost like fear moved across his face. "You need to call this off," Ray said. "Today. Right now." Des laughed, short and humorless. "Because one old man knows how to throw a punch? Because that's not an old man," Ray said. "That's what's left of one." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to, not to Des, who waved him off with the particular confidence of a man who'd never once had to test whether his confidence was earned, and told the room this changed nothing. If anything, he said, it meant they needed to finish this properly, Send everyone. Make sure Millfield understood exactly who ran that street, and make sure this Reyes character understood he'd made the worst mistake of his life, sending 3 men home limping. Reyes didn't argue further. He just sat on his crate, quiet, watching men who didn't understand what they were about to walk back into start making calls to bring in the rest of the chapter. Back at Seal's Café, the afternoon had gone almost peaceful. New glass was already on order. Maddie sat at the counter with a bag of ice on her wrist, watching her father sweep, and finally asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the moment he crossed that floor. Where did you learn to move like that? Jack didn't stop sweeping. Long time ago. That's not an answer. He looked at her then, and something in his face, tired, careful, the face of a man deciding how much of a door he was willing to open, softened for just a second before he set the broom against the counter. It doesn't matter anymore, he said. That's over. This is my life now. You, this place, that's it. He believed every word of it when he said it. The phone behind the counter rang before he'd even picked the broom back up. He let it go twice. Something about the rhythm of it, insistent, unhurried, like whoever was calling already knew he'd answer eventually, made him set down the broom slower than he'd set anything down in years. He picked it up on the 3rd ring. A voice he didn't recognize said his full name, then it said something else, something short, and whatever easy look had been resting on Jack Reyes' face for the last 6 years, packed up and left for good. Maddie watched her father's hand tighten around the receiver, watched the color leave his face for the first time she could remember, and understood, before he said a single word back into the phone, that whatever was coming next was nothing like what had already happened that morning. It was going to be so much worse. Say that again, Jack said into the phone, quiet, though nothing in his voice sounded like a question anymore. The voice on the other end repeated it, told him they knew exactly who he was now, told him this had stopped being about $200 a week. The second 3 of their men came home describing exactly how he'd moved. Told him they were coming back, all of them, and that this time there'd be no one left standing to describe it afterward. Then the line went dead. Jack set the receiver down slower than he'd set anything down in years. 6 years of quiet mornings of flipping eggs and pouring coffee and never once raising his voice, and all of it had just been cut through in the space of 11 seconds by a man he'd never met. He understood 2 things with total clarity. The first was how little time he had. The second was that the man he'd spent 6 years trying to leave behind in a folder he'd never fully opened was about to walk back into this room, whether Jack wanted him to or not. Dad. Maddie was already standing, the ice bag forgotten on the counter, watching his face the way you watch someone doing math they don't want to be doing. Who was that? He didn't answer right away. He walked to the front window instead, looked out at the ordinary street, the hardware store 2 doors down, a woman walking a dog past the new glass that had only been installed an hour ago. Everyone needs to go home, he said. Now. Not after lunch. Now. He said it to the whole cafe, not just to her, and something in his voice, flat, certain, the voice of a man who has made this exact call before and knows precisely what it costs to be wrong about it, moved people out of their seats without a single question asked. The old man folded his newspaper. The mother gathered her stroller. Within 90 seconds, Seal's Café was empty except for Jack and his daughter, standing in a room that still smelled faintly of spilled coffee and broken glass that hadn't finished being swept up. You too, Jack said. No. Maddie, I'm not leaving you here alone with whatever's coming. Her voice cracked on the last word. Not from fear exactly. Or, not only from fear. You don't get to decide that for me. He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was weighing, it didn't take long to lose. Take the truck, he said instead. Go to your cousin south, I need you gone. Not because I'm scared for myself. Because I don't want you here for what I'm about to have to do. She didn't move. He walked into the back office instead of arguing further, and came out a minute later, holding a small steel case, the kind with a combination lock gone slightly stiff with disuse. He set it on the counter and opened it. Inside, resting on faded felt, sat a set of dog tags, a folded certificate, and a challenge coin worn smooth on one side from years of being carried in a pocket that wasn't there anymore. He didn't explain any of it. He didn't need to. Maddie had grown up hearing enough, guessing enough, filling in enough silences at enough dinners to understand, all at once and completely, that the quiet man who'd handed her an apron and a key to the back door had once belonged to a world she'd only ever heard about, in the careful, edited way people talk about things they were told not to talk about. 22 years, Jack said, closing the case. Special operations. I'm not going to tell you more than that, not because I don't trust you, because some of it isn't mine to tell. He looked at her, and for the first time that day, something like grief crossed his face. Old and familiar. The kind a person carries so long it stops looking like grief and starts looking like weather. I built this place so I'd never have to be that man again. I need you gone so I don't have to be him in front of you. Maddie took the truck keys. She didn't drive to her cousin's south. She made it as far as the gas station across the street, pulled under the awning, and sat there with her hands on the wheel, unable to make herself go any further, some part of her refusing to leave him completely alone with whatever was about to happen. Jack locked the back door, righted the chairs the first crew had broken, reached beneath the register to a compartment he'd checked every single morning for 6 years and never once needed to open, and left his hand resting there without opening it yet. Then he waited. He heard them before he saw them, a low building rumble on Route 9, engines climbing, the specific sound of a great many men arriving at once with no plan to leave anyone behind who could describe it afterward. The first bike cut its engine right outside the door, then another, then more than Jack cared to count, through the new glass, spreading along the front of the building the way water spreads when it's looking for the lowest point. This crew came in slower than the first 3 had, and Jack understood exactly what that meant. Careful men were more dangerous than angry ones. Angry men made mistakes. Careful men had already decided what they were willing to do, and were simply working out the order to do it in. Des Cole came in last, stepping over glass that was still settling from where his men had kicked the door wide, and something about his face had changed since the last time he'd sat at this counter smiling. The smile was gone. What replaced it was tighter, more calculated. A man trying to look like he was still in control of a situation he'd clearly been told he might not survive, misjudging twice. Heard you used to be somebody, Des said. Guess we'll find out. 11 of them fanned into the room, more than half carrying something, a length of chain, a bat, one man with something heavier tucked into his waistband that he hadn't pulled yet. They spread along the walls in a pattern Jack recognized immediately, boxing the room from 3 directions, cutting off every angle a man his age should have had no way of anticipating. He didn't wait for them to finish. The man closest to the register with the chain was the real threat, and Jack was on him before the chain finished its first swing, a strike to the throat that dropped him gasping to the tile. The room exploded after that, 11 men in a space too narrow for all of them to reach him at once, which was the only thing keeping Jack alive through what followed. He put his back to the counter, so they could only come at him from the front, and made every one of them pay for it. A bat caught his shoulder instead of his skull, and his arm went half numb. He kept moving anyway. His body told him, in a language 40 years of quiet mornings hadn't erased, exactly how much older he was than the last time he'd done this, every joint a half-second slower, every recovery costing something it hadn't used to cost. He broke a wrist, with a knife still in the hand attached to it, turned the blade the wrong direction, watched it hit the floor. He put a man through the pastry case that had already been broken once that morning. Then a length of pipe caught him across the back of the skull, and the whole room tilted sideways in front of his eyes. He hadn't seen it coming. Not fully. His knees buckled, and across the street, behind the gas station glass, Maddie's hand flew to her mouth, and she stopped breathing entirely for one long second, certain, along with every man left standing in that cafe, that they were about to watch Jack Reyes go down for good. He didn't go down. He found the counter edge with one hand and pulled himself upright through something that had nothing left to do with training and everything to do with refusal, and put the man who'd swung the pipe on the ground with a single elbow that ended the question completely. But he was bleeding now, badly, from somewhere along his hairline, and slowing in a way his body hadn't slowed 9 seconds into the first fight. 6 men were still standing. That was when Des Cole, who'd hung back near the door through all of it, finally reached for what was tucked into his waistband. The gun came out, and every sound in the cafe stopped at once. Jack stood against his own counter, blood running along his jaw, and looked straight down the barrel held by a man whose hand was shaking badly enough that the shake itself became its own kind of warning. Des had built an entire operation on noise and fear, and had never once had to actually pull a trigger on a living person. Now he stood facing the single most dangerous thing he would likely ever encounter in his life, and the gun felt considerably heavier in his hand than it had 10 seconds earlier. Jack spoke, quiet, the same exact quiet he'd used 3 days before, the day one word had rearranged everything. "You gonna pull that trigger," he said. "You'd better not miss. Because the second that bullet doesn't put me down, I'm going to take that gun out of your hand. And there won't be any more talking after that. Not for you. Not for any of them." Des's finger didn't move off the trigger. Neither did his eyes, wide now, locked on Jack's face. Doing the same math every man left standing in that room was quietly running and getting nowhere with. That was the exact moment the front door opened again. Maddie walked in through the broken doorway, glass crunching under her shoes, and stopped just inside where every man in that room could see her. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't need one. She was holding the steel case her father had shown her 20 minutes earlier, open now, held up at chest height where the light from the window caught the dog tags and the coin worn smooth on one side. "You want to shoot him," she said, and her voice didn't shake nearly as much as she expected it to. "You go ahead. But you should know exactly who you're doing it in front of." Nobody moved. "If you're going to pull that trigger," he said, "you'd better not miss. Because the second that bullet doesn't put me down, I'm going to take that gun out of your hand, and there won't be any more talking after that. Not for you, not for any of them." Des's finger didn't move off the trigger, neither did his eyes, wide now, locked on Jack's face, doing the same math every man left standing in that room was quietly running and getting nowhere with. That was the exact moment the front door opened again. Maddie walked in through the broken doorway, glass crunching under her shoes, and stopped just inside where every man in that room could see her. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't need one. She was holding the steel case her father had shown her 20 minutes earlier, open now, held up at chest height where the light from the window caught the dog tags and the coin worn smooth on one side. "You want to shoot him," she said, and her voice didn't shake nearly as much as she expected it to. "You go ahead. But you should know exactly who you're doing it in front of." Nobody moved. Des's gun stayed level, but something in his grip had changed. The shake wasn't fear of Jack anymore. It was the specific fear of a man realizing he'd wandered somewhere with no clean way back out. Reyes was the one who broke the silence from where he still stood near the wall, hands empty, having taken no part in the last 90 seconds. "Des, put it down. Stay out of this. I told you this morning to call it off." Ray's voice carried the particular weight of a man who'd already said everything he had to say once and resented having to say it twice. "You didn't listen. Now look at where you're standing." He nodded once, not at Jack, but at the case in Maddie's hands, at what it meant to men who'd spent their whole lives building fear out of nothing and had just walked face first into someone who'd built something real instead. "Every man in this room knows what that case means," Ray said. "You put a bullet in him, you're not just killing some diner owner. You're telling every unit, every VFW hall, every man who ever served with somebody like him, exactly what kind of outfit did it. That doesn't stay quiet. That follows you into whatever hole you try to hide in." It wasn't the whole truth. Nobody in that room could say for certain what would happen next, what phone calls might or might not get made, what network might or might not still remember a name like Reyes. But it didn't need to be provable. It only needed to be believable enough to make a scared man's arm feel heavier than it already did. Des looked at Jack. Bleeding, upright, still standing exactly where he'd stood 3 days earlier, when he'd said one quiet word and meant it completely. The gun came down. Slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument his arm had been losing for the last 30 seconds. Jack stepped forward and took it out of his hand. Des let him. It was over. Police arrived within minutes, called by a regular who'd never actually left, watching from the gas station lot alongside Maddie the whole time. What they found matched exactly what 6 months of complaints from other business owners on the strip had already started to suggest. a pattern investigators would later describe as one of the more thorough extortion cases the county had prosecuted in years. Once statements from the hardware store, the laundromat, and half a dozen others finally lined up against a crew that could no longer intimidate anyone into silence. Des Cole was arrested at the scene, along with 6 of his crew. Ray Doss wasn't among them. He'd stepped back the moment the gun came out, and when questioned separately weeks later, he was the one who gave investigators the clearest account of everything, including his own earlier warning to Des that morning in the garage. It didn't erase what he'd been part of. It did, eventually, earn him a lighter outcome than the others, and something closer to the version of himself he'd apparently been trying to remember he still had. The Iron Reaper's local chapter collapsed within a month. The hardware store stopped paying within the week. The laundromat owner walked down personally to shake Jack's hand, something he hadn't been able to bring himself to do the day the brick came through his own window. Jack spent one night in the hospital for the head wound and came home the next morning against the doctor's fairly clear preference that he stay longer. Maddie drove him. Neither of them said much on the way, but she kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his arm the entire drive, and he let her. The cafe reopened 4 days later, new glass in the door, the photographs still on the back wall. The flag still folded in its case, though people looked at both a little differently now, not with pity, and not quite with the easy unawareness of before, but with something closer to understanding. A few of the older regulars had recognized fragments of the name Reyes once it started circulating, the way certain names do in towns full of people who served once and never talk about it. Nobody asked Jack directly. He wouldn't have answered if they had. What he did do, weeks later, was hang one more photograph on that wall, a small one, easy to miss unless you were looking for it, of himself and Maddie standing in front of the cafe the morning it reopened. Maddie asked him, once, months afterward, whether he regretted opening the door that first morning, instead of just paying the $200 and letting it go. He thought about it while he wiped down the counter, the same unhurried motion he used for everything. No, he said, I regret it took somebody trying to hurt you before I let myself remember who I used to be. He looked at her. I don't regret becoming this either. The quiet part, that's still who I want to be most days. She let that sit for a while before she spoke again. You could have told me, before all this. I know. He set the rag down. I was hoping I wouldn't have to. Seal's Cafe ran busier that year than it had in all 6 years combined, though the fuss wore itself down eventually, the way fuss usually does, back into something closer to ordinary. Jack still opened at 5 every morning, still never raised his voice at anyone who worked for him, still kept that steel case in the back office, closed now, and it stayed that way. Nobody in Millfield ever again needing to find out what was inside it. Behind the register, the flag still hung in its glass case, a little crooked from where it had been knocked during the fight, and never quite straightened all the way back. Jack liked it that way. Left it exactly as it was. If a story like this ever crossed your path, an ordinary person underestimated by someone who never bothered to ask who they were really dealing with, what do you think would have happened if Maddie hadn't walked back through that door? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.